Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to be talking about what evolution can tell us about human morality. In order for this to make sense, you really need to have some background knowledge of two books in particular. One is Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind. To get your head around the basics very quickly, I would recommend watching a video by Friended on this, which I'll link in the show notes. I'll play a brief clip of it here. And the other book that you need to get your head around is Thomas Sowell's A Conflict of Visions. And again, you can get your head around the basics in a very good YouTube video, again, which I'll link in the show notes, by a chap called Economics Decoded. Again, I'm going to play an excerpt at the start of this. Everything I say after that should make sense once you get your head around those two things. Thank you.
I got a question. What is
morality?
Morality.
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 morality, and where does it come from?
No.
The theory of moral emotions is relatively new. It's called Moral Foundations Theory, and it's based on the scientific research of Jonathan Haidt, Craig Joseph, and a team of social psychologists at yourmorals.org, and builds on the previous work of cultural anthropologist Richard Schwader and French sociologist Emile Durkheim. You can read more about it on Wikipedia or moralfoundations.org, where it states, Moral Foundations Theory was created by a group of social and cultural psychologists to understand why morality varies so much across cultures, yet shows so many similarities and recurrent themes. In brief, the theory proposes that several innate and universally available psychological systems are the foundations of intuitive ethics. Each culture takes these base intuitions and constructs virtues, narratives, and institutions on top of them, creating the unique set of moralities we see around the world today. You can think of these moral foundations like the very basic flavors we all use: sweet, salty, sour, to make up the world's wide array of cultural cuisines. Currently, there's evidence for 6 evolutionarily based moral foundations, and I'm going to go through them all briefly, but researchers in the field admit this list may not be exhaustive. Future psychological or sociological research could uncover more. 1. Care-harm. Probably the most obvious of the moral foundations. We're all mammals with strong evolutionarily based attachment systems binding us to our families and young. These attachment systems allow us to empathize with others, feeling in ourselves others' pain and suffering. This system evolved to give our species a survival advantage in the production of strong and viable offspring, but is also useful inside our moral communities in fostering kindness, gentleness, and nurturant feelings towards our peers and the wider community at large. 2. Fairness cheating. With an emphasis on proportionality, the Fairness Cheating Foundation evolved as a mechanism to aid us in our pursuit of reciprocal altruism. Reciprocal altruism works when we receive a fair portion for the effort we contribute, but the whole system can break down if free riders step in, siphoning off disproportionate resources from the group. To deal with the free rider problem, humans evolved a keen sense of justice, rights, and fairness. These intuitions fill us with angry indignation whenever we see others in the group taking more than they contribute or deserve. 3. Loyalty betrayal. This foundation evolved during our long history as tribal organisms, able to form shifting and beneficial coalitions. It underlies the virtues of patriotism and self-sacrifice for our group or tribe. The evolutionary system is active anytime we feel the sense that it's all for one and one for all. This foundation was critical during our evolutionary development when changing climate and limited resources encouraged groups of individuals to band together. Any group or tribe that was able to monopolize shelter and resources had a distinct survival advantage over less cohesive groups. These less loyal groups could easily disband or become the subjects of conquest by more cohesive groups. 4. Authority subversion. We evolved from lower primate species. The Authority Subversion Foundation evolved during our long primate history when our daily lives revolved around hierarchical social interactions. It underlies the virtues of leadership and followership, including deference to legitimate authority and respect for family and cultural traditions. Like the Loyalty Betrayal Foundation, authority subversion gave groups of individuals a distinct survival advantage through the ability to work together swiftly and efficiently as a strong and cohesive team. 5. Sanctity degradation. This foundation was shaped by the psychology of disgust and contamination. It evolved to meet the adaptive challenge of the omnivore's dilemma and the broader challenge of surviving in a world of pathogens and parasites. The moral emotion surrounding this foundation is the feeling of disgust. This feeling evolved to defend our mouths and bodies from dirty or inappropriate inappropriate contaminants, and has been appropriated by our moral reasoning to extend that disgust to certain people, groups, symbols, or ideas, with any potential to contaminate our moral communities. 6. Liberty oppression. This foundation centers around the feelings of resentment towards people or organizations who dominate or restrain us. These intuitions are often in conflict with those of the Authority Subversion Foundation, forcing us to strike a balance between the two. The emotions surrounding the Liberty Oppression Foundation involve the hatred of bullies and dominators, motivating people to come together in solidarity to oppose and or kill any would-be oppressors. These emotions likely developed once our species evolved the ability to make and use tools. With the advent of weaponry, reverse dominance hierarchies allowed our species to develop a more egalitarian lifestyle, since keenly aware individuals could now easily unite with weaponry against any domineering alphas that might threaten or even annoy the group.
One of the curious things about political opinions is how often the same people line up on opposite sides of different issues. The issues themselves may have no intrinsic connection with each other. They may range from military spending to drug laws to monetary policy to education. Yet the same familiar faces can be found glaring at each other from opposite sides of the political fence, again and again. That's how Thomas Sowell's book Conflict of Vision starts. Sowell argues the reason for this curious phenomenon is because both groups of people have fundamentally different assumptions about human nature and human abilities. Sowell describes what could be thought of as a spectrum for visions. On the one side of this vision spectrum is constrained, and on the other side is unconstrained. I personally think it's easier to look at the two sides as limited and unlimited, but he wouldn't call them that. In reality, visions can be anywhere on this spectrum. For example, Marxism is actually a hybrid of both visions, whereas fascism is in multiple places at once, it seems. But for ease of understanding, the spectrum of all possible visions is split up into two distinct groups to illustrate the differences. The goal for public policy people of either vision is usually to create the best outcome for society. The problem is the core assumptions are so different from each other that they never end up agreeing on the same way to get to the same destination. At the core of each vision is some belief about human nature. Essentially, what are people's ultimate potential? Both visions see the base or starting point of human nature as flawed and imperfect, that people are selfish and just barely smart enough to get by. The constrained vision doesn't see these factors as changing. It says our base nature will always be that of a self-centered, just smart enough person. The unconstrained vision sees the exact opposite. Yes, it says people start off by being just smart enough and self-centered, but we can change our human nature to be closer and closer to perfection.
The constrained vision sees human nature as fundamentally unchanging and hence an ultimate constraint on what can realistically be expected from human beings. Accordingly, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. Individuals need incentives to encourage naturally good behavior and disincentives to encourage naturally bad behavior. Society must erect institutions to help curb humanity's baser instincts. The unconstrained vision, on the other hand, has no truck with empirical reality. It is insulated from evidence. Through confirmation bias, those who hold it will look only for evidence that confirms their existing beliefs and systematically ignore facts inconvenient to its narrative. Although the constrained vision derives from empirical knowledge, those who hold it can also be guilty of confirmation bias. Now, while there can be little doubt that the constrained vision is closer to empirical reality than the unconstrained vision, evolutionary studies nonetheless vary in how they characterize human nature, and as such have reproduced their own version of the conflict of visions. The effort to understand morality from a biological perspective started with Charles Darwin himself in The Descent of Man. Unfortunately, it was not long after this that Darwin's ideas were hijacked by survival of the fittest social Darwinists such as Herbert Spencer and William Graham Sumner. While enormously popular in their day, Spencer and Sumner had fallen out of fashion by the 1930s. The first years of the 20th century would also see Darwin pressed into service for a utopian vision, where the unconstrained idea of human perfectibility reached its most terrifying conclusion in eugenics. In Britain, Francis Galton believed that aspects that make up human character, such as moral virtues or dispositions, were hereditary traits. In Germany, such thinking resulted in atrocity. Now, perhaps understandably, research into the relationship between ethics and biology was considered taboo until the mid-1970s and the pioneering work of Edward O. Wilson, especially in his books Sociobiology, The New Synthesis, and On Human Nature. Wilson argued that to find a new morality based on a more truthful definition of man, it is necessary to look inward, to dissect the machinery of the mind, and to retrace its evolutionary history. The central moral dilemma for biologists and evolutionists is perhaps summed up best by Adam Smith in The Theory of Moral Sentiments. However selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. If human beings are naturally selfish, then why should they take pleasure in the fortune of others? If we are self-interested, why are people sometimes moved to help other people when there is no obvious gain in doing so? Darwin himself was puzzled by this. He noted that human beings are unique among animals in caring for weaker members of a society, even at the apparent detriment to survival. And this is Darwin. He says, "With savages, the weak in body or mind are soon eliminated, and those that survive commonly exhibit a vigorous state of health. We civilized men, on the other hand, do our utmost to check the process of elimination. We build asylums for the imbecile, the maimed and the sick. We institute poor laws, and our medical men exert their utmost skill to save the life of every one to the last moment. There is reason to believe that vaccination has preserved thousands who, from a weak constitution, would formerly have succumbed to smallpox. Thus, the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. It is surprising how soon a want of care, or care wrongly directed, leads to the degeneration of a domestic race. But expecting in the case of man himself, hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed." For Darwin, this impulse to help the less fortunate and helpless is mainly an accidental result of the instinct of sympathy, which was originally acquired as part of the social instincts, but subsequently rendered more tender and more widely diffused. He sees this instinct extending to men of all races, to the imbecile, the maimed, and other useless members of society, and finally to the lower animals. He argues that the more mankind nurtures this natural sympathy, the standard of his morality will rise higher and higher. Indeed, he thinks that the standard of morality has risen since an early period in the history of man. Thus, for Darwin, it is in us to be nicer to each other, which he views as a mark of civilized man. This is, of course, the morality of care and harm. Although Darwin's consideration of morality in The Descent of Man is couched in the racially and culturally insensitive language typical of his period, when considering various indigenous peoples from Africa, the Americas, and Australia, he nonetheless recognizes their moral capacities, even if these often seem constrained by groupishness. This is Darwin again. He says, "As barbarians do not regard the opinion of their women, wives are commonly treated like slaves. Most savages are utterly indifferent to the sufferings of strangers or even delight in witnessing them. It is well known that the women and children of the North American Indians aided in torturing their enemies. Some savages take pleasure in cruelty to animals, and humanity is an unknown virtue. Nonetheless, besides family affections, kindness is common, especially in sickness, between members of the same tribe, and is sometimes extended beyond those limits. Mungo Park's touching account of the kindness of the Negro of the interior to him is well known. Many instances could be given of the noble fidelity of savages towards each other, but not to strangers. Common experience justifies the maxim of the Spaniard, never, never trust an Indian. Now one might imagine that the natives had similar expressions about the Spaniards, but it is clear from Darwin's account that the so-called savages do possess the natural sympathy he ascribes to civilized man, under the right conditions. Now what is interesting here is that Darwin starts to spot other types of morality beyond that of care and harm. For example, he spots the moral foundation of authority in Native American Stoicism. As soon as a tribe has a recognized leader, disobedience becomes a crime, and even abject submission is looked on as a sacred virtue. The American savage voluntarily submits to the most horrid tortures without a groan to prove and strengthen his fortitude and courage, and we cannot help admiring him. And Darwin also seems to spot the moral foundation of sanctity. This is Darwin again. He says, as soon, however, as marriage, whether polygamous or monogamous, becomes common, jealousy will lead to the inculcation of female virtue, and this being honoured will spread to the unmarried females. How slowly it spreads to the male sex we see at the present day. Chastity eminently required self-command. Therefore, it has been honoured from a very early period in the history of civilized man. As a consequence of this, the senseless practice of celibacy has been ranked from a remote period as a virtue. He goes on to reveal that his own understanding of morality is, in Jonathan Haidt's term, weird. That is, primarily concerned with the individual rather than with the community or in-group. Like most Western liberals, he downplayed the moral foundation of authority, sanctity, and loyalty. Thus, according to Darwin, savages regard actions as good or bad solely as they obviously affect the welfare of the tribe, not that of the species, nor that of an individual member of the tribe. Now, in this sentence, Darwin drew the key battle lines of contemporary evolutionary ethics. Did morality develop primarily to serve the survival of the tribe or group? Or did it develop to serve the survival of the whole species? Or did it develop primarily to serve the survival of the individual? Now, plainly, Darwin saw tribal morality as being at a more primitive stage of development to moralities that foreground the whole species or the individual. It is something that he has in common with the globalists of today, who are so quick to condemn the deplorable nationalists. But is it true that there is such a hierarchy of progress between the moral foundations? It seems unlikely. The key dispute in evolutionary ethics since the 1970s has centered on questions of altruism versus selfishness and group selection versus kin selection. In The Righteous Mind, Jonathan Haidt's shorthand metaphor is that we are selfish and we are groupish, 90% chimp and 10% bee, by which he means, in the clear majority of cases, human beings like chimpanzees are self-interested, but nevertheless retain a certain capacity for cooperation and altruism to protect the hive or in-group. For some, this allows for rather too much altruism, and for others, too little. At the polar ends of this dispute, we find in the corner of altruism and group selection, or multi-level selection, among others, Edward O. Wilson, David Sloan Wilson, Elliot Sober, and Leo Buss. And in the corner of selfishness and kin selection, among undoubtedly a greater number of others, because it is the orthodox position, we find Richard Dawkins, Steven Pinker, Daniel Dennett, David M. Buss, Robert Wright, and John Toby and Leda Cosmides. To make matters more complicated, both groups have found common enemies in Stephen Jay Gould, Niles Eldridge, and Richard Leontin. who stood against the entire enterprise of sociobiology and its successor, evolutionary biology, arguing that their concept of humanity is too limited. As per the unconstrained vision, Gould, Eldridge, and Lewontin emphasized cultural and ideological causes through their conception of species selection and the related idea of punctuated equilibrium. Just as Thomas Sowell lost patience with those holding the vision of the United, so Gould's opponents came to see him as little more than an ideologue concerned with an anti-capitalist progressive political agenda rather than with the truth. His essays become revealed as mini-theatricals carefully staged for purposes of self-aggrandizement rather than for the careful and charitable pursuit of truth. That was Tooby and Cosmides. As Daniel Dennett put it, Gould has gone from revolution to revolution. So far his declarations of revolution have all been false alarms, and he has kept on trying, defying the moral of Aesop's fable about the boy who cried wolf. These are vast disagreements which, across the decades, have raged sufficiently to be dubbed the Darwin Wars. As such, I cannot hope to do their complexity justice here beyond offering the briefest of sketches. At the heart of the dispute is a disagreement over levels of causation. When successful evolutionary adaptations occur in animal species, do they take place at the level of the entire species, or on the level of the in-group, or rather on the level of the individual animal and its offspring? I have put the three options into this table, as you can see there: species selection at the macro level, group selection, in-group level or multi-level, and then the kin selection at the gene level. Now, we need not concern ourselves with species selection, which has been largely debunked. The key debate is currently between kin selection and group selection, which in lay terms is a contrast between the dog-eat-dog view of nature and a new emphasis on the bright side of biology. To take examples from the extreme ends, for Richard Dawkins, evolution is like survival in the tough world of Chicago gangsters, in which the predominant quality to be expected in a successful gene is ruthless selfishness. In this view, evolution is an explanation rather than a moral justification. I am saying how things have evolved. I am not saying how we humans morally ought to behave. While this ruthlessly selfish view of nature may seem unpalatable, unfortunately, however much we may deplore something, it does not stop being true. And because of this, in Dawkins' view, we must teach our children altruism, for we cannot expect it to be part of their biological nature. In sharp contrast, the primatologist Frans de Waal, who has built his career on providing evidence for empathy and a sense of fairness among the primates and even among the other animals, argues that humans are group animals, highly competitive, sensitive to injustice, sometimes warmongering, but mostly peace-loving. It is interesting that despite ostensible appearances, it is de Waal who attributes more of our behaviour to nature, and Dawkins who gives the greater scope for cultural perspective. Indeed, in The Selfish Gene, from which I am taking these quotations, he grants quite extraordinary powers to cultural memes that start to approach the unconstrained vision. Although David Sloan Wilson has advocated for group selection passionately through the 70s, 80s and 90s, it was largely dismissed as a heterodox and fringe position among biologists, except where their arguments helped them fend off Stephen Jay Gould and the claims made by species selection. This is the case, for example, in Daniel Dennett's Darwin's Dangerous Idea. Elsewhere, such as in The Moral Animal by Robert Wright, the idea was given short shrift. The heart of the dispute is that advocates of kin selection claim that they can explain away virtually any evolutionary trait as having developed for the benefit of the gene, rather than for the benefit of the group. Thus, Steven Pinker argues, The recent surge of interest in group selection has been motivated by two empirical phenomena. One is eusociality in insect taxa, such as bees, ants, and termites, whose worker or soldier castes forego their own reproduction and may sacrifice their lives to benefit their fellows, as when a bee dies when stinging an invader. E. O. Wilson notes that a self-sacrificing insect benefits the colony, and concludes that eusociality must be explained by selection among colonies. But other biologists point out the fact that the sacrificer benefits the queen, her sister or mother, who founds a colony when she reproduces. So the simplest explanation of eusociality is that the genes promoting self-sacrifice were selected because they benefited copies of themselves inside the queen. In virtually all cases, people like Pinker and Dawkins argue that apparently selfless and altruistic behaviour can be put down to either nepotism or reciprocity. Individuals give alarm calls not to protect their group, but to protect their genes. Female control the number of eggs laid or babies born, not to aid the population regulation and save the group from extinction, but rather to optimize the number of offspring that survive and reproduce. Incidentally, that was a quote from Marc D. Hauser's book, Moral Minds. Anyway, Jonathan Haidt has followed David Sloan Wilson and others in rejecting, or at the very least complicating, this claim based on new empirical evidence from studies conducted since the 1970s. Their charge, which has gathered momentum since the turn of the 21st century, is that while kin selection is undoubtedly true in some cases, it cannot explain away instances where stronger individuals, bullies or egotists are subdued to confer long-term group advantages afforded by cooperation. For example, William Muir has found that when breeding chickens for egg production, if you select only the most productive hens, who tend to be more aggressive and dominant, the total number of eggs goes down because of the increased levels of aggression, which result in killings and cannibalization. By using group selection, that is, breeding all the hens in a cage, not simply the most productive ones, the death rate fell from 67% to just 8%, and the total number of eggs jumped up from 91 to 237 in just 3 generations. So that's from 91 eggs to 237. Haidt suggests that similarly rapid development can occur in human societies, and this might be one reason why religions have persistently developed in cultures around the world. Religion helps to promote in-group social cohesion, curbs the most aggressive and dominant characters, and greatly increases the capacity for cooperation and hence the social productivity of a society. In outlining the positive functions of religion in this way, Haidt offends Richard Dawkins and his allies Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, and of course the late Christopher Hitchens, together the four horsemen of New Atheism, and he offends them on 2 counts. He not only returns to group selection, a concept Dawkins strongly opposes, but he also gives an evolutionary rationale for religion. This is an argument first outlined in David Sloan Wilson's book, Darwin's Cathedral, in which he compares religious organizations to a social insect colony and outlines the many group advantages that have conferred to human groups over the centuries. Accordingly, in his book The Moral Landscape, Sam Harris has criticized Haidt on 2 grounds. First, that the 6 moral foundations might all be collapsed into different manifestations of care and harm, since the others are all ultimately about reducing harm in the long run. And second, that his defense of religion is wrong-headed because it can be shown to cause more harm than good, and also by the fact that it is simply not true. That is, the Bible isn't factual. For Harris, morality must have a basis in scientific truth. We need not concern ourselves with the lengthy exchanges between Harris and Haidt on this matter. The underlying difference between the two of them comes down to the central dichotomy in Arthur Herman's The Cave and the Light. Harris is a rationalist trying to derive truth through pure reason. Haidt, meanwhile, is an empiricist simply describing things as they can be observed. In other words, Harris is subscribing to the unconstrained utopian vision. Implicitly, he imagines a world where human beings are no longer groupish or tribal, where the social functions traditionally provided for by religious institutions are no longer needed. Even though he is an atheist himself, Haidt sees no such possibility, and it seems to me the weight of evidence is entirely on his side. We need only look at the recent events in places like Charlottesville and Boston to see that this groupish tribal element to humanity is going to be there whether we have religion or not. Joshua Greene has been another prominent critic of Haidt. In Moral Tribes, while he agrees with many of the core arguments of the righteous mind, like Harris, he ultimately has a problem with the emphasis that Haidt places on intuitionism. This is Greene. He says, "My first important disagreement with Haidt concerns the role of reason, of manual mode. In moral psychology, I believe that manual mode thinking has played an enormously important role in moral life, that it is, once again, our second moral compass. Haidt disagrees. He thinks that moral reasoning plays a minor role in moral life, a conclusion neatly expressed by the title of his famous paper, The Emotional Dog and Its Rational Tail." Greene's basic problem here is that Haidt's prescription to try to negate self-righteous indignation by understanding where your political adversary might be coming from, i.e. by understanding the underlying moral foundations to which they are responding, does not tell us what to do next. As Greene put it, it's one thing to acknowledge that one's opponents are not evil, it's another thing to concede that they're right, or even half right. But ultimately this comes down to a political disagreement. As we saw earlier, Haidt thinks that liberals, weird people, are blind to 3 out of the 6 moral foundations, and so effectively are morally colourblind. All Greene can offer here is this. One might say, as Haidt does, that liberals have narrow moral tastes, but when it comes to moral foundations, less may be more. Liberals' moral tastes, rather than being narrow, may instead be more refined. To take this stance, he invokes rationalist Enlightenment values. Note that this is the same argument that Darwin made when comparing the various Native American and African tribes to Victorian England. It seems to me that Greene seeks to make this argument almost exclusively because Haidt's evidence does not fit with, as Thomas Sowell would put it, the vision of the anointed. It is perfectly transparent that Harris takes issue with Haidt because his work seems to defend religion, which he doesn't like, and that Greene takes issue with it because it seems to defend conservatives, who he doesn't like. As Sowell predicted, when faced with hard evidence, and even in the sciences, those who hold utopian visions will prefer to keep their differential rectitude rather than accept the facts. They will invariably find some issue with those who describe things as they really are, and not how they should be.